There's a moment every man remembers. Not the big ones, not the weddings or the funerals or the births. The small ones, the ones that burn. For Clyde Macklin, that moment came on a Saturday afternoon in October of 1979 at a consignment auction outside Marshalltown, Iowa. He was 26 years old. He'd driven 14 miles in a '68 Ford pickup with a cracked windshield to bid on a Farmall 560 diesel that was listed in the sale bill. The tractor had 6 to 200 hours on it. Needed a clutch. The paint was more rust than red. But Clyde had grown up on Farmalls, knew the 560 engine inside and out, and he had $1,400 cash in an envelope in his shirt pocket, money he'd saved over 2 years of custom baling for neighbors at $125 a bale. He was standing near the equipment line, waiting for the 560 to come up, when a voice behind him said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, look at that. Clyde Macklin's here to buy another piece of junk." Clyde turned around. The voice belonged to Ray Loomis, 47 years old, owner of Loomis Implement, the John Deere dealership on Highway 30 east of Marshalltown. Gold watch, pressed western shirt, ostrich skin boots that cost more than Clyde's truck. Ray was leaning against his brand-new Silverado with the dealership logo on the door, holding a styrofoam coffee cup and grinning at the men around him. "Son," Ray said, "why don't you stop wasting your time with that red junk and come see me Monday? I'll put you in a 4440 with air conditioning, finance the whole thing. You won't have to get your hands dirty anymore." The men laughed. A few of them were Ray's customers. A few owed him money. Clyde didn't say anything. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at Ray the way a man looks at weather he can't change. And then Ray did something that Clyde would carry for 12 years. He looked down at Clyde's boots, work boots, cracked leather, manure on the soles, and he spit. Not at Clyde exactly, but close enough. Close enough that the tobacco juice landed on the toe of Clyde's left boot, and every man standing there saw it. "Farmers like you don't last," Ray said. "You'll be gone in 5 years." Clyde looked down at his boot. He looked up at Ray, and he said the only thing he said that whole afternoon, "We'll see." Then he walked to the auction ring, bid $1,150 on the Farmall 560, loaded it on a borrowed trailer, and drove home on gravel roads while the sun went down. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt. He looked like a man who'd just been handed a reason. To understand what happened next, you need to understand these two men, where they came from, what they believed, and why one of them survived the worst agricultural disaster in 50 years, while the other one lost everything. Ray Loomis was born into the equipment business. His father, Harold Loomis, had opened the John Deere dealership in 1951, the year Deere & Company was aggressively expanding its dealer network into every town in the Midwest, with 900 people or more. Harold was a sharp businessman, bought the lot on Highway 30, built a showroom with a plate glass window facing the road, and put the biggest John Deere sign money could buy on the roof. By 1960, he was the top-selling dealer in the district. Ray took over in 1972, when Harold retired, and Ray had a gift his father didn't: salesmanship. Harold sold tractors the old way, quietly, patiently, letting the iron speak for itself. Ray sold tractors the new way. He sold lifestyle. He sold status. He sold the idea that a man who drove a new John Deere was a modern farmer, a serious operator, a man going places. And a man who was still running a 20-year-old Farmall? Well, that man was going nowhere. By 1979, Loomis Implement was moving 30 to 35 new units a year. John Deere 4440s at $32,000, 4840s at $55,000. The big four-wheel drives, the 8440 and 8640, at $70,000. Ray had a financing deal with the John Deere Credit Corporation that made it easy. Too easy. Farmers could walk in with 20% down and walk out with a machine that cost more than their house. The interest rate in 1979 was 9.5%. It felt reasonable. It wouldn't stay that way. Ray drove a new Silverado every year, wore a Rolex, had a lake house in Okoboji. He was the kind of man who measured success by what you could see, and he made sure everyone could see his. Clyde Macklin was a different animal entirely. His grandfather, Edwin Macklin, had homesteaded 160 acres in Marshall County and broke the prairie with a team of horses and a walking plow. Edwin's son, Clyde's father, Warren, expanded to 280 acres and bought the family's first tractor in 1941, a Farmall H. Warren farmed with that H and later a Farmall M for 30 years. He never borrowed money after paying off the original Federal Land Bank note in 19. When people asked Warren why he didn't buy new equipment, he said the same thing every time. The bank doesn't farm my land. I do. Warren died of a heart attack in the field in 1976, sitting on the seat of his Farmall M, which was still running when they found him. He was 6. He left Clyde the 280 acres, the M, a workshop full of tools, and not a single dollar of debt. Clyde was 23. He'd been farming with his father since he was old enough to reach the clutch pedal. He knew the land, he knew the equipment, and he knew, because his father had told him 1,000 times, that debt was the only thing that could take the farm away. So when everyone around him was borrowing to expand, buying land at $3,000 an acre, trading up to new John Deeres, building new grain storage, Clyde did what his father would have done. He stayed small, he stayed careful. He farmed the 280 acres with the Farmall M and the 560 he'd bought at auction. He grew corn and soybeans in rotation. He kept 30 head of cattle on grass. He did his own mechanic work in the shop his grandfather had built. And every month, he put what was left into a savings account at the Marshall County State Bank. By the end of 1979, the year Ray Loomis spit on his boot, Clyde had $23,000 in savings, 0 debt, and 2 paid-for Farmall tractors with a combined value of maybe $3,500. Ray Loomis that same year had dealership inventory worth $1.4 million, floor plan financing of $900,000, a personal net worth built almost entirely on the rising value of farmland he'd bought as investment, and a lifestyle that required $8,000 a month to maintain. One of these men was standing on rock. The other was standing on a bubble, and the bubble was about to pop. In October of 1979, the same month Ray spit on Clyde's boot, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker did something that would reshape rural America for a generation. He raised interest rates. Not a little, a lot. The federal funds rate, which had been around 10%, was pushed to 20% by June of 19. The prime lending rate, the rate banks used for their best customers, hit 20. The logic was sound. Inflation was running at 13.5%, and Volcker believed the only way to break it was to make money so expensive that spending would slow down. It worked. Inflation came down. But the cure nearly killed the patient, especially in farm country. Here's what happened. Every farmer who had borrowed money in the 1970s at 9% suddenly found his loans renewing at 16, 17, 8. Operating loans that cost $9,000 a year in interest now cost 8. Land payments doubled. Equipment payments on those shiny new John Deeres went from manageable to crushing. At the same time, the export market collapsed. In January of 1980, President Carter imposed a grain embargo against the Soviet Union after the invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviets had been buying 25 million metric tons of American grain per year. Overnight, that market vanished. Corn prices dropped from $350 to $220 a bushel. Soybeans fell from $9 to $550. And then the land values started falling. Iowa farmland, which had peaked at $2,147 per acre in 1981, began a slide that wouldn't stop until it hit $787 per acre in a 63% drop. Every farmer who had borrowed against his land equity watched his collateral evaporate. The numbers were catastrophic. Between 1981 and 1988, over 300,000 American farms were lost. The Farm Credit System, the network of federally chartered banks that financed American agriculture, reported losses of $2.7 billion in 1985 alone. The Federal Land Bank of Omaha failed. Rural banks closed by the dozen. For every 4 farms that went under, 1 Main Street business closed with it. The suicide rate among farmers rose to 3 times the national average. And the dealerships. John Deere laid off workers by the thousands. Their Waterloo, Iowa plant, the heart of Deere manufacturing, cut its workforce so deep that the city lost 14% of its population. Deere reported a net loss of $229 million but the company survived. It had the balance sheet to absorb the losses. The dealers didn't. Ray Loomis started feeling it in New tractor sales dropped from 32 units in 1979 to 11 in By 1983 it was 6. Farmers weren't buying. They couldn't. The ones who'd bought in the late 70s were now trying to make payments on machines that were worth less than they owed. Some brought the tractors back. Ray had to take them, repossessions that he'd have to resell at a loss, if he could sell them at all. His showroom, which had been full of gleaming green and yellow iron, started filling with used equipment, trade-ins he couldn't move, repos he couldn't unload. He had a 4840 sitting on the lot for 9 months with a price tag that dropped 3 times. He had 2 4440s that he'd taken back from farmers who'd walked away from their loans. The floor plan interest on his inventory was eating him alive because his interest rate had doubled too. Ray cut his staff from 8 to 4. Then to 2. His wife started doing the books. He stopped buying new Silverados. The Rolex went into a drawer. The lake house went on the market. Meanwhile, Clyde Macklin kept farming. His costs hadn't changed much. He owned his land free and clear. He owned his tractors free and clear. His operating costs were diesel, seed, fertilizer, and his own labor. He didn't owe the bank a monthly payment. He didn't owe John Deere credit a dime. When corn dropped to $2.20, it hurt, but it didn't kill him because he didn't need 3 brick corn to make a loan payment. He needed 2 brick corn to cover his costs and put a little away. He kept the cattle, which provided a second income stream. He kept doing custom baling, which brought in cash through the summer. He fixed his own equipment in the shop, replacing the 560's clutch himself over a weekend with parts he bought from a salvage yard for $85. He didn't eat out. He didn't take vacations. He drove the same '68 Ford pickup, and every month he put money in the bank. By 1985, while his neighbors were getting acceleration notices from the Farmers' Home Administration, letters demanding full repayment of loans in 15 or 30 days, Clyde's savings had grown to $67,000. He had the only thing that mattered in a depression, cash and no debt. That year, something happened that would set the stage for everything that followed. Clyde's neighbor to the north, a man named Gene Drayton, lost his farm. Gene had bought 320 acres in 1978 at $2,800 an acre, $896,000, with a federal land bank loan at 9.5. By 1985, the land was worth maybe $900 an acre, and his loan was renewing at 4. He couldn't make the payments. The bank foreclosed. The auction was scheduled for March. Clyde went to the auction. He stood in the back, quiet, watching Gene's life get sold off piece by piece. The combine, the planter, the grain bins. Gene's wife sat in the truck with the kids and didn't come out. When the land came up, the auctioneer started at $1,200 an acre. Nobody bid. He dropped to $1,000. Silence. $800. A hand went up, a land speculator from Des Moines. $800 an acre for 320 acres of good Marshall County ground that had sold for $2,800 7 years earlier. Clyde raised his hand. $850. Meanwhile, the speculator looked at him. Clyde, $950, the $1,000. The speculator crossed his arms. Clyde, $1,050. The speculator shook his head and walked away. Clyde Macklin bought Gene Drayton's 320 acres for $1,050 an acre, $336,000 total. He paid $67,000 cash every dollar he'd saved over 10 years, and took a modest mortgage from the Marshall County State Bank for the balance at 11. The banker who wrote the loan later said it was the easiest farm loan he'd approved in 3 years. Macklin had no other debt, he said. None. In 1985, that was like finding a unicorn. Clyde now had 600 acres, one farm all M, one farm all 560, and the first loan of his life, a loan he could service even at 2-bite life, corn. Ray Loomis held on longer than most dealers. He had his father's stubbornness, if not his father's caution. He refinanced, he restructured, he begged John Deere for better floor plan terms. He sold the lake house. He sold his wife's car. He took a second mortgage on their home in Marshalltown. But the math was unforgiving. His inventory was depreciating. His interest costs were rising. His customers were disappearing. Every month, the hole got deeper. In the spring of 1987, Deere reported a first-quarter net loss of $192.6 million. The company was slashing costs everywhere. Closing plants, merging facilities, raising equipment imports from 8 to 20%, and they started squeezing their dealers. The requirements to maintain a John Deere franchise were getting more expensive every year. Larger showrooms, more inventory, better facilities. Deere's corporate philosophy was moving toward fewer, larger, multi-location dealers. The small-town, single-location operators like Ray Loomis were being pushed out, not just by the crisis, but by the company they'd built their lives around. In August of 1988, Ray Loomis closed the doors of Loomis Implement, the big John Deere sign on the roof. The one his father Harold had put up in 1951 went dark for the last time. 37 years, gone. The bank took the building. The inventory, what was left of it, went to auction. 6 used tractors, a combine that needed work, a shop full of tools, parts bins half empty, a showroom with nothing in it but fluorescent lights and oil stains on the concrete floor. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in September. Cool day, overcast. The kind of day that makes everything look gray. Clyde heard about it at the feed store. He didn't say anything. He went home, ate supper, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he drove to the Marshall County State Bank the next morning and talked to the banker. On the morning of the auction, Clyde Macklin was standing in the back of the crowd, work boots, Carhartt jacket, same as always, quiet. The tools went first. Snap-on roll cabinet, $400. Air compressor, $200. The specialty equipment, the diagnostic machines, the hydraulic test stand, went for pennies on the dollar. Nobody needed John Deere specialty tools when there weren't enough John Deere customers to justify them. Then the building came up. The auctioneer described it. 4,800 square feet, showroom, service bay, parts counter, office, on Highway 30, good visibility, good access. The bank wanted $45,000, which was a fraction of what Harold Loomis had spent building it. The opening bid was $20,000. A contractor from Marshalltown raised his hand. A woman who wanted to convert it to a storage facility. Clyde raised his hand. $30,000. $32,000 from the contractor. $35,000 from Clyde. Always. Clyde's voice was flat. No emotion. Like he was calling a lot number at a cattle sale. The contractor shook his head. Nobody else bid. Sold. $40,000 to Clyde Macklin. The crowd murmured. A few men turned to look at Clyde. Some recognized him. Some remembered the auction in '79 where he'd bought the Farmall 560. A few remembered the story about Ray and the boot. Clyde walked up, signed the papers, and wrote a check. Cash. No loan. He'd been saving again, 3 years of careful farming on 600 acres, putting aside everything he didn't need to live on. The $40,000 came from the same place his $1,150 for the Farmall 560 had come from. Work, patience, and time. He now owned the building where the man who'd spit on his boot had sold tractors for 15 years. Now I want to be clear about something. Clyde didn't buy that building for revenge. He bought it because it was a good deal on a good building on a good piece of highway, and he needed a shop big enough to service his growing operation. He converted the showroom into an equipment storage area. He turned the service bay into his main workshop. He kept the parts counter because it was useful for organizing his own bolts and bearings and hydraulic fittings. But he did one thing that people in Marshalltown talked about for years. He left the old John Deere sign mounting brackets on the roof. And above the front door, where Ray Loomis had hung a sign that said, "Loomis Implement Your John Deere Connection," Clyde hung a new sign, hand-painted, simple, black letters on white wood. It said, "Macklin Farm EST, 1902, nothing else, no brand, no slogan, just the family name and the year his grandfather broke the first furrow." The word got around. You know how small towns work. Everybody knew the history. Everybody knew about the boot. And when they drove past that building on Highway 30 and saw that sign, they understood what it meant, even if Clyde never said a word about it. Clyde kept farming the way he'd always farmed. By 1991, he'd paid off the mortgage on Gene Drayton's 320 acres, 6 years early. He replaced the Farmall M with a used Farmall 806. He bought at an auction in Grundy County for $1,400 cash. He kept the 560 running because it still had life in it. He expanded the cattle herd to 60 head. He started renting an additional 160 acres from a widow down the road who couldn't farm it herself, paid her $85 an acre, cash, and she was grateful because nobody else had offered. By 1991, Clyde was farming 760 acres with 2 paid-for Farmall tractors, operating out of a building he'd bought for less than the price of one new John Deere wheel. His total debt? Zero. The county ag census that year showed that Marshall County had lost 34% of its farms since 19. The ones that survived were overwhelmingly the ones that had carried little or no debt through the crisis. The ones that disappeared were the ones that had expanded on borrowed money, bought the new iron, bought the high-priced land, trusted the bankers and the dealers who said the good times would never end. And Ray Loomis? Ray took a job selling insurance in Des Moines after the dealership closed. He and his wife divorced in 1990. The financial stress had been too much. He moved into an apartment. He drove a used Buick. He was 56 years old and starting over with almost nothing. In the spring of 1991, 12 years and 6 months after the day at the auction, Ray Loomis drove back to Marshalltown. He'd heard about the building. He wanted to see it. He parked across Highway 30 and sat in his car for a while, looking at what used to be his dealership. The shape was the same, the bones were the same, but the John Deere sign was gone, and in its place was that hand-painted sign, Macklin Farm ST. A red Farmall 560 was parked beside the building. The same one. He recognized it. The dent in the hood, the replacement fender, the exhaust stack that leaned slightly to the left. The tractor he'd laughed at 12 years ago was still running, still working, still there. Ray sat in his car for 20 minutes. Then he drove across the highway and pulled into the lot. Clyde was in the shop, replacing a hydraulic hose on the 8. He heard the car door and came out wiping his hands on a rag. He saw Ray and stopped. The two men looked at each other for a long time. The last time they'd been this close, Ray had been wearing ostrich skin boots and a gold watch. Now he was wearing rubber-soled shoes from Sears and a jacket that didn't fit right. "Clyde," Ray said. "Ray." A pause. "Place looks good," Ray said. "It works." Another pause. Long enough to feel the wind. "I drove past here 100 times when it was mine," Ray said. "Never thought I'd be standing in the lot looking at someone else's name on the door." Clyde nodded. He didn't gloat. He didn't remind Ray about the boot. That wasn't the kind of man Clyde was. Instead, he said something that Ray would think about for the rest of his life. "Ray, the building's just a building. The tractors are just tractors. The only thing that matters is whether you own them or they own you." Ray stared at him. Then he looked down at his own shoes. The cheap ones. The ones that replaced the ostrich skin boots. And for the first time in 12 years, He understood what the tobacco juice on Clyde's boot had really been. Not a mark of dominance, but a confession of fear. Ray had spit because Clyde scared him. Because Clyde didn't need anything Ray was selling. And a salesman with nothing to sell to a man who doesn't need to buy, that's a man who knows he's standing on nothing. "I'm sorry about the boot," Ray said quietly. Clyde looked at him for a moment. Then he held up the rag in his hand. "You any good with a wrench?" Ray blinked. "I used to be. I've got a hydraulic hose that's fighting me. Could use a second pair of hands." The two men walked into the shop together. The fluorescent lights buzzed the same way they had when the building sold John Deere's. The oil stains on the floor were the same ones, but everything else had changed. They fixed the hose in 40 minutes. Clyde poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos. They sat on upturned buckets in the shop and drank it without saying much. When Ray left, he shook Clyde's hand. It was the first time they'd ever touched. Clyde Macklin farmed until 2008. He was 55 when he handed the operation to his son Warren Jr., named after the man who'd taught him that debt was the only enemy a farmer couldn't outwork. By then, the 600 acres had grown to 920 through 3 more careful purchases, all cash or short-term notes paid off early. The farm all 560 finally retired in 2001 at 19,400 hours. Clyde parked it inside the building on Highway 30 in the spot where the John Deere showroom floor used to be. He never got rich. That was never the point. He got something the money couldn't buy and the debt couldn't take away. He got to stay. In 12 years, 300,000 farms disappeared across America. Men who bought the biggest iron, borrowed the most money, and listened to the loudest voices, they're gone. And a quiet man with cracked boots and a $1,150 farm awl is still on the land where his grandfather broke the first furrow in 19. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. The man who laughs loudest at the auction isn't the man who wins. The man who wins is the one who's still farming when the laughter stops.